Hi, Gregory Klump here, Chief Economist for the Canadian Real Estate Association, with more news on national housing activity over multiple listing service systems of Canadian real estate boards for June 2011. Before getting into the latest national statistics, let me emphasize that housing market trends often differ due to a number of local factors. And for that reason, you should consult your local realtor to understand how trends are shaping up in your local housing market. That said, here's a quick summary of how national figures are shaping up in June. On the demand side of the housing market equation, national sales activity climbed from May to June with a big year-over-year increase reflecting falling demand 1 year ago. That said, sales in the first half of 2011 were in line with the 10-year average. On the supply side of the housing market equation, the number of newly listed homes rose from May to June, which helped steady the number of months of inventory. From a market balance standpoint, the national housing market remains firmly entrenched in balanced territory. And lastly, national average price is still being skewed upward by the value of sales in expensive Vancouver neighborhoods, and price gains in other markets are providing additional loft. Keeping that summary in mind, let's take a look at the national figures in more detail, starting with sales. Seasonally adjusted national sales activity rose almost 3% in June 2011 compared with the previous month, with 2/3 of local markets having posted monthly increases in activity. Calgary, Montreal, Ottawa, London, Hamilton, Burlington, and Victoria led the way among major markets that posted monthly activity gains. Actual, that is not seasonally adjusted sales activity, came in almost 11% above June 2010 levels. This largely reflects falling sales activity last June. During the first half of 2011, some 245,170 homes traded hands via Canadian MLS Systems. Activity in the first half of 2011 ran in line with the 10-year average, with monthly sales having come close to the 10-year average every month so far this year. So that's the demand side of the national housing market equation. Let's take a look at the supply side and the balance between supply and demand. The number of newly listed homes rose nationally by almost 2% from May to June, with gains in Toronto, Vancouver, and Ottawa contributing most to the national increase. With both sales and new listings having risen, the national housing market in June remained firmly planted in balanced territory. The national sales to new listings ratio, a measure of market balance, stood at 52.6% in June, which is little change from the 52.2% in May. About 60% of local housing markets in Canada were balanced in June. Almost half of the remainder can be classified as sellers markets based on a sales to new listings ratio of above 60%. The seasonally adjusted number of months of inventory stood at 6 months at the end of June on a national basis, holding steady compared to May. The number of months of inventory represents the number of months it would take to sell current inventories at the current rate of sales activity and is another measure of the balance between housing supply and demand. And lastly, let's look at average price. The national average price for homes sold in June 2011 reached almost $372,800, up nearly 9% from the same month last year. In recent months, it's been widely recognized that Vancouver has been skewing the national average price upward. In June, the national average price was less affected by the level of sales in a few expensive Vancouver neighborhoods, but it was still being pitched upward by the value of those sales. Activity in these neighborhoods has eased from levels reported in February and March, while sales elsewhere in Canada have risen in line with normal seasonal trends. As a result, property sales above $1 million in Vancouver West, West Vancouver, and Richmond now account for a smaller but still elevated share of national activity. While the effect of Vancouver activity on the national average has begun to wane, broadly based price gains in other housing markets are holding the national average price aloft. Close to 80% of local markets posted year-over-year average price gains in June. This includes Toronto, where price gains reflect a tight balance between supply and demand. Overall, the national figures for June show that the Canadian housing sector remains on a solid footing. The rise in monthly home sales activity at the end of the second quarter, upbeat business sentiment and hiring intentions, and signs that the Bank of Canada is in no rush to raise interest rates bode well for home sales activity and prices going into the second half of 2011. I'll be back soon with CREA's updated 2011 and 2012 forecast for national and provincial sales activity and average price, so stay tuned.